He hired a maid to clean his mansion, but she ended up healing his son and his soul. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. The hushed, almost reverent silence of the Worthington Estate's sprawling grounds was a world away from the vibrant, chaotic, and often, heartbreakingly, human realities of Clara Hayes's life. Here, amidst the towering, ancient oaks and the meticulously sculpted hedges, the air was thick with the scent of old money, cut grass, and a profound, almost suffocating loneliness. Clara, at 47, moved through this opulent, silent space with a quiet efficiency that rendered her almost invisible, a ghost in a worn, but meticulously clean, housekeeper's uniform. She was here, as she was every weekday, a part of the silent, diligent army of staff who maintained the illusion of effortless perfection for the estate's sole and largely unseen occupant. To her colleagues, she was a quiet, reliable presence, a woman who did her work with a steady, uncomplaining grace. To her employer, the formidable and largely absent Alastair Worthington, she suspected, not even a name, just a line item on a payroll, a function, a part of the seamless machinery of his vast, empty life. They rarely, if ever, saw the profound intelligence in her quiet, observant dark eyes, or the subtle weariness that went bone-deep from years of physically demanding labor, stretching muscles already frayed by age. They certainly didn't know that Clara Hayes, the unassuming housekeeper, was a woman of vast, though uncredited, knowledge. Her mind held a quiet understanding of child psychology gleaned from countless hours spent in quiet libraries before her shifts began, a deep appreciation for classical music devoured in the dim light of her cramped apartment after 12-hour days, and an almost intuitive grasp of human nature, honed by years of observing the raw, unvarnished emotions of the powerful and privileged from the invisible vantage point of her humble profession. But in this world, the world of the Worthington estate, those pursuits were irrelevant. Here, her value was measured in the gleam of the marble floors, the dust-free surfaces of antique furniture, the pristine appearance of the countless, often unused, rooms. She accepted her role with a quiet stoicism, a dignity that was born of necessity. Her son, Leo, a brilliant, ambitious young man currently navigating the treacherous, expensive waters of a prestigious medical school, was the sun in her quiet, solitary universe, the driving force behind her relentless, back-breaking labor. Every floor she mopped, every toilet she scrubbed, every silver frame she meticulously polished, was a small, silent act of love, of duty, a contribution to a future she might never see, but for which she was fiercely, unwaveringly committed. She had once dreamed of a different life, of a career in education, of nurturing young minds, of making a difference in the world. But life, with its cruel, indifferent twists, had derailed those dreams. A family tragedy, a devastating financial setback, and the sudden, crushing weight of single motherhood had forced her to trade her scholarly pursuits for a cleaning cart, her intellectual ambitions for the practical realities of survival. She rarely spoke of her past, not even to her few colleagues. It was a locked room within her, filled with ghosts and what-ifs, a place too painful to revisit. So, she moved through the glittering, empty world of the Worthington estate, a silent philosopher, charting the orbits of the privileged, her own star long since fallen, or so it seemed. She cleaned their messes, absorbed their casual, almost invisible, condescensions with a quiet resilience, her true self hidden beneath layers of practiced invisibility, a secret held close, like a precious, fragile fragment of starlight. Her days were a blur of aching muscles and the rhythmic hum of the floor polisher. Her nights a quiet vigil of worn textbooks and murmured conversations with her son, his triumphs, his struggles, a constant driving force. This particular afternoon, the air in the estate felt heavier than usual, charged with a subtle tension that even the soft rustle of leaves in the wind couldn't quite smooth over. A powerful, unyielding, and deeply sorrowful presence had returned to the house, shifting its delicate equilibrium, and Clara, with her heightened senses, felt it acutely. It was about to be a long afternoon, filled with unspoken demands and subtle power plays. The reason for the palpable tension at the Worthington estate was the unexpected and largely unwelcome return of its master, Alastair Worthington, and his young, disabled son, Thomas. Alastair, a titan of industry whose ruthless business acumen was legendary, was a man unaccustomed to powerlessness. Yet, in the face of his son's profound and largely misunderstood disability, he was utterly and infuriatingly helpless. Thomas, a boy of 8, was a wisp of a child, his body small and fragile, his mind a brilliant, chaotic, and often inaccessible universe of its own. He was nonverbal, his communication a complex, often frustrating tapestry of gestures, of sounds, of subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in his mood and demeanor. He was prone to sudden, overwhelming sensory meltdowns, episodes of raw, untamed distress that left his powerful, in-control father feeling like a clumsy, inadequate, and utterly failing parent. Alastair had spared no expense in his relentless, almost desperate quest for a cure, for a solution, for anything that might fix his broken son. A parade of renowned specialists, of therapists, of educators, had passed through the Worthington gates, each armed with their theories, their techniques, their promises of progress. And each, in turn, had departed, leaving behind a trail of hefty invoices, of patronizing platitudes, and of a deeper, more profound sense of failure and despair in Alastair's already bruised and battered heart. Today, Alastair had returned from yet another of these fruitless consultations, this one with a celebrated and astronomically expensive behavioral psychologist from Vienna. The psychologist's final, damning assessment, delivered in cool, clinical tones, still echoed in Alastair's mind. The boy is profoundly resistant to conventional therapeutic interventions. His prognosis is limited. I would advise managing your expectations, Mr. Worthington. Managing his expectations. The words were a slap in the face, a dismissal of his fierce, albeit clumsy, love for his son, a confirmation of his own deepest, most terrifying fears. He now sat in his vast, silent study, a glass of expensive, untouched whiskey in his hand, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window, his face a mask of cold, hard, and utterly desolate grief. Thomas, meanwhile, had been left in the care of his current nanny, a young, well-meaning, but increasingly overwhelmed woman named Miller. The boy, agitated by the long, stressful journey, by the unfamiliar faces, by his father's own palpable distress, was on the verge of one of his meltdowns. His small body was rigid, his hands fluttering, a low, keening sound emanating from his throat, a sound that was a prelude to a full-blown storm of sensory overload. Clara, her own work for the day complete, was just about to leave when she heard it. The sound of the boy's distress, a sound that resonated with something deep within her own maternal soul. She saw the nanny, Miller, her face pale with a mixture of fear and frustration, trying to soothe the boy, her efforts, however well-intentioned, only seeming to exacerbate his agitation. Clara hesitated. Her job was to clean, to be invisible. Intervening was not in her job description. It was a breach of protocol, a crossing of a line she had, for years, so carefully, so diligently, maintained. But then, she looked at the boy, at his small, trembling form, at the raw, untamed terror in his eyes, and she felt not a sense of professional obligation, but a profound, almost overwhelming wave of human compassion. She saw not a problem to be managed, but a child, a small, terrified soul, lost in a storm of his own making, a storm that no one, it seemed, knew how to calm. She thought of her own son, Leo, of his childhood fears, of the quiet, intuitive ways she had learned to soothe him, to comfort him, to speak to him in a language that went beyond words. And in that moment, a decision, born not of logic, but of a deep maternal instinct, was made. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs, and she walked, not with the hesitant, apologetic shuffle of a housekeeper, but with the quiet, confident grace of a woman who knew, with an almost spiritual certainty, what needed to be done. She approached the nanny, her voice a low, gentle murmur. "Excuse me, Miss Miller," she said, her tone respectful but firm. Perhaps I could try." Miller looked at her, her expression a mixture of surprise, of relief, and of a faint, almost imperceptible condescension. "You, Clara?" she asked, her voice incredulous. "What could you possibly do?" The specialist "Just for a moment, Miss Miller," Clara interrupted, her voice still gentle, but now imbued with a quiet, unwavering authority. "Please." Miller, at a loss, and perhaps a little desperate herself, finally, reluctantly, stepped aside. Clara knelt down, not in front of the boy, not in a way that would be perceived as a threat, but beside him, her movements slow, deliberate, her presence a quiet, calming anchor in his turbulent, chaotic world. She didn't speak. She didn't touch him. She simply was, a still, silent, and profoundly empathetic presence. And then, she began to hum, a low, soft, repetitive melody, a tune her own grandmother had sung to her, a simple, ancient lullaby from her homeland, a song that spoke of quiet rivers, of whispering winds, of the deep, enduring, and ultimately healing peace of the natural world. It was a sound that was not a command, not a demand, but an invitation to a world of calm, of safety, of a profound and deeply human connection. Alastair Worthington, drawn from his study by the sudden, and then equally sudden, cessation of his son's distress cries, stood in the doorway, a silent, unseen, and utterly astonished observer. He saw the scene before him. His son, his unreachable, inconsolable son, no longer rigid with terror, but slowly, almost imperceptibly uncurling, his small body beginning to relax, his gaze, usually so wild, so unfocused, now fixed on the quiet, unassuming housekeeper who knelt beside him, her voice a low, gentle, and almost magical hum. He saw not a cleaner, not a servant, but a woman of profound, intuitive, and deeply surprising power. A woman who was, with a simple, ancient lullaby, achieving what his legions of expensive specialists, with all their theories, all their techniques, had so spectacularly, so heartbreakingly failed to do. She was reaching his son, and in that moment, the first, fragile, and utterly unexpected crack appeared in the icy, desolate wasteland of Alastair Worthington's own long-frozen heart. The quiet, almost sacred scene in the grand, echoing hallway of the Worthington estate continued to unfold. A silent, profound drama played out for an audience of one. Alastair Worthington remained in the doorway of his study, a ghost in his own home, watching, transfixed, as the quiet, unassuming housekeeper, Clara, continued to work her strange, intuitive magic on his son, Thomas. The boy, his earlier, frantic meltdown now a distant memory, had completely relaxed. His small body, once so rigid with tension, was now soft, pliant, his gaze fixed on Clara with a new, almost beatific calm. He was listening, not just with his ears, but with his entire being, to the gentle, resonant, and deeply healing music of her voice. Clara, sensing the shift in the boy's energy, the profound, almost spiritual, yielding in his small, fragile body, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to alter her approach. The humming, which had been a steady, continuous drone, now began to take on a more rhythmic, more conversational quality. She wove in soft, melodic phrases, her native tongue a language of gentle, liquid vowels and soft, sibilant consonants, a language that was not a demand, not a command, but a quiet, loving, and deeply respectful invitation. She spoke to him of the whispering trees, of the patient mountains, of the soaring hawk, her words painting pictures of a world that was not a threat, not a source of overwhelming, chaotic sensory input, but a place of profound, interconnected, and ultimately benevolent beauty. She was not just calming him, she was communicating with him in a language that transcended words, that spoke directly to the raw, untamed, and deeply human heart of his being. The nanny, Miss Miller, stood a few feet away, her face a mask of stunned, almost comical disbelief. She had seen the best, the most expensive, the most celebrated child psychologists in the world attempt to manage Thomas's behavioral issues. She had seen them use charts and graphs and reward systems and carefully calibrated therapeutic interventions. She had seen them all, without exception, fail. And now, here is this housekeeper, a woman with no credentials, no training, no authority, achieving with a simple, ancient lullaby and a few gentle foreign words what they, with all their expertise, all their resources, had deemed impossible. It was a profound and deeply humbling refutation of everything she and the world she represented believed about power, about expertise, about the very nature of healing itself. Alastair Worthington, watching from the shadows, felt a complex, almost overwhelming mixture of emotions. He felt a profound, almost painful gratitude for this strange, unexpected gift of peace for his son. He felt a dawning, reluctant, and deeply humbling respect for the quiet, unassuming woman who was, with such effortless grace, performing this small, everyday miracle. And he felt a deep, gnawing, and profoundly uncomfortable shame. Shame for his own blindness, his own arrogance, his own utter and complete failure to see, to understand, to connect with his own son in this simple, profound, and deeply human way. He had sought answers in science, in experts, in the cold, hard, and ultimately sterile world of data and analysis. He had never once considered the possibility that the key to his son's heart might lie not in a textbook, not in a therapeutic technique, but in a song, in a quiet, empathetic, and deeply human connection. Clara, oblivious to the turmoil raging within the heart of the man who watched her from the shadows, continued her quiet, intimate conversation with Thomas. She then did something even more extraordinary. She reached out, her hand slow, deliberate, unthreatening, and gently, almost reverently, touched the boy's small, clenched fist. Thomas, who usually recoiled from unexpected physical contact, did not flinch. He did not pull away. Instead, his small hand, which had been clenched so tightly in a fist of anxiety and fear, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to unclench. His small fingers, one by one, unfurled, their tension releasing, their rigid defense yielding to the gentle, unwavering warmth of her touch. And then, in a gesture of such profound, almost heartbreaking trust, he turned his small hand over, and his fingers, weak, hesitant, but undeniably, purposefully, curled around her own. It was a connection, a bridge, a silent, eloquent, and deeply moving testament to the power of a simple, unadorned, and utterly transformative act of human compassion. Alastair Worthington felt his own, long-frozen, heart give a painful, lurching thud. He felt a strange, unwelcome prickling behind his eyelids, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, not since. He ruthlessly suppressed it, his face hardening into its familiar, impassive mask. But it was too late. The damage, or perhaps the healing, had already been done. The quiet, unassuming housekeeper, with her gentle voice and her even gentler touch, had not just reached his son. She had, in a single, profound, and utterly unexpected moment, reached him. The Arctic fox, the master of a global financial empire, the man who had thought himself immune to the messy, inconvenient, and utterly debilitating world of human emotion, felt the first fragile and utterly terrifying crack appear in the icy, desolate wasteland of his own long-frozen heart. The fragile, almost sacred peace in the grand, echoing hallway of the Worthington estate, a peace woven from a simple song and a gentle touch, was shattered by the sudden, intrusive ringing of a mobile phone. It was Alistair's, a sharp, insistent, and deeply unwelcome intrusion from the other world, the world of business, of deadlines, of relentless, unforgiving, and ultimately meaningless demands. The sound, so jarring, so out of place in this quiet, intimate moment, had an instantaneous, devastating effect. Thomas, startled, his small body once again rigid with a sudden, overwhelming sensory assault, snatched his hand back from Clara's, his face contorting in a mask of renewed terror, a low, keening sound of distress once again emanating from his throat. The fragile bridge of connection, so painstakingly, so beautifully built, had been shattered in an instant. Alistair, his own face a mask of frustration and a dawning, almost overwhelming, self-loathing, fumbled for his phone, his hand shaking with a mixture of anger and a profound, almost painful regret. He barked a single, sharp command into the phone, "Not now," then ended the call, the silence that followed now thick, heavy, and pregnant with a new, more profound, and deeply personal sense of failure. He looked at his son, at his small, trembling form, at the raw, untamed terror in his eyes, a terror he himself had, with his own careless and ultimately selfish intrusion just reignited. He looked at Clara, at her pale, compassionate face, at the quiet, almost pitying understanding in her dark, intelligent eyes. And he felt a wave of shame so potent, so overwhelming, that it almost buckled his knees. He, Alistair Worthington, the powerful CEO, the master of his universe, was a clumsy, ignorant, and ultimately destructive bull in the delicate, beautiful, and infinitely precious china shop of his own son's fragile and deeply human heart. Clara, however, did not seem to share his despair. She simply met his gaze, a quiet, almost sad smile touching her lips, a smile that held no judgment, no recrimination, only a profound, almost spiritual understanding of the delicate and often easily broken nature of human connection. She then turned her attention back to Thomas, her voice once again a low, gentle murmur, her presence a steady, calming anchor in his renewed, and now even more turbulent, storm of distress. She did not try to touch him again. She did not try to hum. She simply spoke to him, in a language he understood, the language of quiet, unwavering, and deeply respectful presence. She spoke of the storm, of the sudden, loud noise, of the fear it had caused. She validated his feelings, his terror, her voice a gentle, soothing balm to his raw, frayed nerves. "It's okay to be scared, little one," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic caress. "The world is a loud and often frightening place, but the storm will pass. The quiet will return. And you are safe. You are loved. You are home." Her words, so simple, so direct, so filled with a profound, almost mystical empathy, seemed to reach him, to penetrate the thick, suffocating fog of his sensory overload. His trembling began to subside. His keening cries softened, then ceased. His small, rigid body began once more to relax. Alistair watched, his heart aching with a mixture of awe, of gratitude, of a deep and profoundly humbling sense of his own utter and complete inadequacy. This woman, this quiet, unassuming housekeeper, possessed a wisdom, a compassion, a power that he, with all his wealth, all his influence, all his control, could not even begin to comprehend. He knew, with a certainty that resonated in the deepest, most forgotten corners of his soul, that he could not let her go. He could not allow this miracle worker to simply return to her life of mopping floors and dusting furniture, her extraordinary gift unseen, unacknowledged, and ultimately wasted. He needed her. His son needed her. And perhaps, just perhaps, he himself, his own broken and deeply lonely heart, needed her most of all. "Clara," he began, his voice hoarse, raspy, his use of her first name now a conscious, deliberate choice, a recognition of her profound and deeply personal significance in his life and in his son's. I need to ask you something. Something unconventional. Something perhaps entirely inappropriate. But I must ask. Clara looked up at him, her dark, intelligent eyes holding a quiet, watchful, and deeply thoughtful curiosity. I need you, Clara, Alistair continued, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to suppress, to stay. Not as a housekeeper, but as a companion, a guide, a teacher, for Thomas, and perhaps for me. The offer, so audacious, so utterly unprecedented, hung in the air, a stunning, almost surreal pronouncement. The nanny, Miss Miller, who had been a silent, wide-eyed observer to this entire, extraordinary drama, gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was not just a breach of protocol. This was a shattering of the very foundations of their carefully ordered, hierarchical world. A housekeeper, as a companion, a teacher, to the son of Alistair Worthington. It was unthinkable. It was impossible. Yet as Clara looked at Alistair, at his raw, desperate, and undeniably sincere plea, she knew that this was more than just a job offer. It was a lifeline, a chance, a terrifying, improbable, and utterly irresistible opportunity to use her gift, her empathy, her profound, intuitive understanding of the human heart, to make a difference, to heal, to connect, in a way she had only ever, in her wildest, most secret dreams, imagined. Mr. Worthington, she said, her voice quiet but firm, a new, almost regal dignity radiating from her, what you are asking, it is a great responsibility. I know, Alistair replied, his voice a ragged whisper. And I would not ask it of you if I did not, with every fiber of my being, believe that you, and only you, are capable of helping him, of helping us. He looked at his son, now calm, quiet, his small hand once again resting tentatively on Clara's arm. Please, Clara, he said, his voice now a raw, broken, and deeply human plea. Please say yes. And in that moment, Clara Hayes, the quiet housekeeper, the forgotten scholar, the devoted mother, knew that her life, her future, her very destiny, was about to be irrevocably and profoundly changed. The choice, as always, was hers. But the path, it seemed, had already been chosen for her by a force far greater, far more powerful, and infinitely more mysterious than she could ever have imagined. The force of a simple, profound, and ultimately life-altering human connection. The arrangement, as Alistair had so understatedly described it, was indeed unconventional. Clara Hayes, the housekeeper, became Thomas Worthington's personal companion and developmental guide, a title so vague, so deliberately corporate, that it belied the true and profoundly human nature of her role. She was not a nanny, not a therapist, not an educator in any conventional sense. She was a friend, a translator, a bridge between Thomas's brilliant, chaotic, and often inaccessible inner world and the structured, logical, and often unfeeling world of his father. Her days were no longer filled with the monotonous rhythms of cleaning, but with the quiet, patient, and often challenging process of building a relationship with a child who communicated not in words, but in gestures, in sounds, in the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts of his mood and demeanor. She learned his language, the silent, eloquent poetry of his hands, the nuanced, emotional symphony of his hums and his cries. She learned to anticipate his needs, to understand his fears, to recognize the subtle triggers that could send him spiraling into a sensory meltdown. And she learned to create for him a world of calm, of safety, of a profound and deeply healing predictability. She brought the natural world into the sterile, opulent confines of the Worthington estate. They spent hours in the vast, overgrown gardens, Clara teaching Thomas the names of the flowers, the songs of the birds, the feel of the cool, damp earth in his hands. She brought him smooth, warm stones from the riverbed, vibrant, colorful leaves from the ancient oaks, a single, perfect, iridescent feather from a blue jay's wing. She understood, with an intuition that baffled and increasingly humbled Alistair, that Thomas's connection to the world was not intellectual, but sensory, that he experienced reality not through abstract concepts, but through touch, through scent, through the subtle, resonant frequencies of the natural world. She also, to Alistair's profound surprise and dawning, almost overwhelming gratitude, began to heal not just the son, but the father. She insisted, with a quiet, unwavering firmness that brooked no argument, that Alistair spend at least an hour every day with Thomas, not as a CEO assessing a problem, not as a father desperately seeking a cure, but as a man, a father, a fellow human being. She taught him to be still, to be silent, to simply be with his son. She taught him to listen, not for words, but for the unspoken, for the subtle, emotional currents that flowed between them. She taught him to communicate not with demands, not with commands, but with a gentle touch, a quiet hum, a shared, silent, and deeply human presence. It was a slow, arduous, and often profoundly frustrating process for Alistair. He was a man of action, of results, of a relentless, forward-moving momentum. The quiet, patient, and often seemingly unproductive world of his son's reality was a foreign and deeply uncomfortable country. There were days when his old, familiar impatience, his ingrained need for control, would surge to the surface, and he would find himself retreating to the cold, sterile safety of his study, to the familiar, comforting logic of his spreadsheets and his market analyses. But Clara, with her quiet, unwavering, and deeply compassionate persistence, would always gently guide him back. She would remind him, with a simple, profound wisdom that always left him speechless, that the most important connections are not built in a day, that the most profound healing often occurs in the quiet, unseen spaces between the moments, that the true measure of a man's strength lies not in his ability to control, but in his ability to yield, to be vulnerable, to love. And slowly, painstakingly, miraculously, a change began to take place. Alistair began to see his son not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be loved, to be understood, to be cherished for exactly who he was. He began to see the brilliance in his son's chaotic, beautiful mind, the profound, almost spiritual wisdom in his silent, sensory world. He learned to play with him, to laugh with him, to communicate with him in a new, more profound, and infinitely more meaningful language, a language of the heart. The icy, desolate wasteland of his own, long frozen, soul began to thaw, to bloom with a new, unfamiliar, and deeply beautiful life. The laughter of his son, a sound he had thought he would never hear again, became a regular, joyous, and deeply healing music in the once silent, once sorrowful halls of the Worthington estate. The transformation was not just internal. It began to ripple outwards to affect his business, his leadership, his very understanding of the world. He began to see his employees not as assets, but as people. His company not as a machine, but as a living, breathing, and deeply human ecosystem. He began to lead not just with his head, but with his heart. And the results, as always, were surprising, profitable, and deeply, profoundly human. Clara Hayes, the quiet housekeeper, the forgotten scholar, the woman who had been hired to be a companion to a disabled child, had in her own quiet, unassuming, and utterly transformative way become the unlikely and indispensable architect of a new, more hopeful, and infinitely more beautiful kind of empire. An empire built not on power, not on profit, but on the simple, profound, and ultimately life-altering power of a single human connection. The ripple effect of Clara Hayes's quiet, compassionate influence extended far beyond the walls of the Worthington estate, subtly, yet profoundly, reshaping the very fabric of Alistair Worthington's global empire. The Arctic fox, once a name whispered with a mixture of fear and a grudging, almost resentful respect in the boardrooms of the world, now became associated with a new and deeply surprising set of values: empathy, integrity, a genuine and increasingly public commitment to corporate social responsibility. Alistair, guided by Clara's quiet, unwavering moral compass, began to systematically dismantle the ruthless, profit-at-any-cost culture he himself had so meticulously, so successfully cultivated. He established the Thomas Worthington Foundation for Neurodiversity and Inclusive Innovation, a multi-billion-dollar charity dedicated to supporting research, education, and advocacy for children and adults with unique neurological profiles. It was a foundation that did not seek to cure, but to understand, to celebrate, to create a world where neurodiversity was not seen as a deficit, but as a gift, a unique and valuable perspective on the rich, complex tapestry of human experience. He championed policies within his own company that promoted work-life balance, that celebrated diversity, that fostered a culture of mutual respect, of genuine collaboration, of a shared and deeply meaningful sense of purpose. He instituted listening tours, where he would meet not with his high-powered executives, but with the rank-and-file employees, the cleaners, the maintenance staff, the administrative assistants, the unseen, often unheard, cogs in his vast corporate machine. He would listen to their stories, their struggles, their ideas, his own transformation, a powerful, living testament to the profound wisdom that so often lay hidden, untapped, in the quiet, unassuming corners of his own organization. The business world watched in bewildered astonishment as Thorne Industries, once a byword for ruthless, cutthroat capitalism, transformed into a model of ethical leadership, of compassionate, human-centric innovation. And the profits, paradoxically, soared to unprecedented heights, a powerful, undeniable refutation of a long-held corporate belief that ethics and profitability were mutually exclusive. Clara, for her part, remained largely out of the spotlight, her official title still the deliberately vague, personal companion and developmental guide to Thomas Worthington. She had no interest in corporate power, in public acclaim, in the glittering, superficial world of Alistair's professional life. Her focus remained, as always, on Thomas, on his well-being, on his continued, miraculous blossoming. Thomas, under Clara's gentle, patient, and profoundly loving guidance, had indeed blossomed. He was still nonverbal, still prone to occasional, though now far less frequent and far less severe, sensory meltdowns. But he was also happy, engaged, connected. He had learned to communicate, not with words, but with a complex, nuanced, and beautiful language of his own, a language that Clara, and now, to his profound and everlasting joy, Alistair understood perfectly. He had discovered a passion for music, his small, nimble fingers coaxing surprisingly complex and deeply moving melodies from the grand piano in the library, the same piano that had once stood as a silent, painful monument to his father's grief. His music was his voice, his way of expressing the rich, complex, and beautiful inner world that had for so long been trapped within him. His compositions, like his own unique mind, were unconventional, brilliant, and deeply, profoundly human. One cool autumn evening, years after Clara's first fateful encounter with the Worthington family, the grand ballroom of the estate, a room that had for so long been a silent, echoing testament to a life of lonely, opulent despair, was filled with a new, vibrant, and deeply joyful sound. It was the sound of music, of laughter, of a community, a family, a world reborn. Alistair, his face alight with a quiet, profound, and deeply peaceful contentment, stood beside Clara, watching as Thomas, now a confident, happy, and profoundly loved young man, sat the grand piano, his fingers dancing over the keys, his music a beautiful, intricate, and deeply hopeful symphony of his own creation, filling the room, filling their hearts, filling the world with a light, a warmth, a joy that had once seemed impossible. The guests, a diverse, eclectic collection of people from all walks of life. Corporate executives and community activists, world-renowned musicians and local school teachers. The powerful, the privileged, and the profoundly, beautifully ordinary listened, their faces a mixture of awe, of reverence, of a shared and deeply human understanding. They were all, in their own way, a testament to the quiet, transformative power of a single, simple, and utterly life-altering act of human compassion. The story of Alastair Worthington, of Clara Hayes, of Thomas, the boy who had taught them all how to listen, how to connect, how to love, became a quiet legend, a modern fable of redemption, of healing, of the profound, often unseen, and deeply beautiful music that lies hidden, waiting to be discovered within the heart of every human being. It is a reminder that true strength lies not in control, but in connection. That true wisdom lies not in knowledge, but in empathy. And that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in the simple, profound, and ultimately life-altering power of shared and deeply human love. If you ever feel that the world has grown too loud, too chaotic, too unfeeling, remember Clara Hayes. Remember the quiet, healing power of a simple song. Remember the profound, unspoken language of the human heart. And remember to listen, to truly listen. For in the quietest, most unassuming of spaces, in the most unexpected of hearts, you may just find the most beautiful, the most transformative, and the most hopeful symphony of all.